I'm going to start today in the finest of Canadian traditions with not just one apology, but three apologies. The first apology is these beautiful slides you see on the background are going to disappear. The lights are going to come up. There'll be no more images. This is just a little eye candy for you. Gardens are beautiful many times, and I don't compete very well with beauty, so I'm going to get rid of those in a minute. The second apology relates to Francis's introduction. I could be dismissed fairly easily as being a dilettante that's moved between polar bear ecology to South African desert work to Louisiana coastal marshes. And throughout my career, I have taken the low-hanging fruit, the things that fascinate me, the things that I'm passionate about. It may be career ADD. It may be that I've been lucky and been in the right place at the right time for various projects. But I think there's a place in the university for those of us that are an inch deep and a mile wide. And it probably is best suited to the policy and the synthesis and transdisciplinary end of things. I've made this argument a long time, but I will never be a U of A world expert on one thing. And so I apologize to our upper admin for that. My second apology. So the third apology is one that is a bit of an awkward thing, and that is to start out with the premise that I apologize that gardens are so damn unnatural. If one thinks about it, they're probably as bad on the naturalness scale as a transgenic field of canola. What do? We take a patch of land, we recontour it so it drains properly, we remove the natural vegetation, we supplement the soil or change the soil entirely, then we bring in a bunch of exotic species, then we stop all successional processes by weeding like crazy, then we alter the hydrologic regime by adding water, and then we exclude all pests except maybe some pollinators. It's a macabre world of Franken plants, but they hit our values. We achieve this bucolic, this area that smells nice. It's eye candy, and so it's an odd thing. We're dealing with values here. We're basically painting, if you will. We're painting with vegetation rather than with oils. Did you do that? Thank you. And I'm going to turn this off now. Try to turn this off right now. And Francis is going to turn this off for me now. You know, I taught in this class for 6 years. You'd think I would know that, but my mind is elsewhere right now. Thank you. So they have these values. And how many here have been to Butchart Gardens? Okay, I have not. I've heard about it. I've seen pictures. I had some pictures in my talk about that. It's a treat for the senses, the smells, the eyes, the ambiance. It's not a botanic garden. Devonian Botanic Gardens is a botanic garden. 11,000 named plants, ongoing studies, detailed following of these plants, groups by phylogeny. There are a lot of things. There's research programs going on. There are a lot of things there that distinguish us. Now, there happen to be some beautiful things, but it doesn't have to be beautiful all the time. Hi. For example, Lynn Siegler has made a career out of studying small brown smudges. And they're basically, these are fungal analyses. I wish Renee Bellan was here. Renee works for me. Renee has made a career out of studying mosses. And mosses all look alike, right? Well, not exactly. But critically important stuff, but they're not necessarily the eye candy of the plant world. So I'd like to start today with what, as I promised in my abstract, a little commentary on the history of plants and gardens and how they've been so critical to the development of science. And I like to think that our botanic garden is one of those places that's continuing this contribution. Historically, gardens were very utilitarian in purpose. They as my herbalists and botanists in my garden like to remind me, they were mostly there to produce soporifics, emetics, poultices, recreational drugs, poisons, recreational poisons, all sorts of things that we now distance ourselves from. But just as soon as we distance ourselves from them, we start thinking, okay, those aromatherapies, come on, give me a break. Those poultices, well, I'm guessing there's at least a few people in this room that have had transdermal patches, which is just a modern plasticized poultice. I mean, give me a break. Aromatherapy, it's coming into its own. We're looking at some of the stimulation, and I'll cite some of the research a little later about that. But plant use has really been coming around since the dawn of time. And I'm sorry about the camera. I'm going to wander around a little bit. But some of the more dramatic things, Shanidar II in modern-day Iraq, an area that 60,000 years before present, they've uncovered this Neanderthal group, 4 or 5 Neanderthal skeletons. And as usual, they did palynology, the pollen record. And 7 of the 8 plants discovered are currently known as therapeutic plants, the pollen. And so the twigs went off. Were these guys either embalming, collecting, burying with a selection of known plants? Were these cultivated? There's another school of thought that says the pack rats did it. But it seems a bit of a coincidence that this has occurred here. You've all heard of the Lascaux Caves in France. The Lascaux Caves, much of the pigmentation there was done with plants that were palatable, that were chewed up, berries and such, and blown through a tube on there. So there's a suggested use of directed use of plants for their properties, if you will. Now that's sort of straining things. The written record helps us a hell of a lot, I have to admit. So I'm going to start, there are 2 timelines here. I'm going to start at 5,000 and quickly run down to 500. Then I'll hit the more recent things as well. There's so many stories woven into this. And this, I hate to say, this is just my own research looking back. Where do these botanic gardens come from? Why are they there? Qiannong gardens and Chinese gardens 5,000 years ago, at least we know they were putting up walled protected areas and growing selected beds of plants. What for? We aren't exactly sure, but we do know they were organized. Sumerians in Iraq, they had plants, over 260 cataloged species of plants grown for specific purposes. So this was a strong motivation. The Shang dynasty in China, 3,500 years before present, similar to the Qiannong. Even today, the Ayurvedic, if I'm saying that right, tradition of Indian medicine continues relatively uninterrupted through time, and it's gaining credibility. Dr. Stephen Ong on the medical faculty here has made a real reputation for himself, having 1 foot in Western science, being a medical doctor, and 1 foot in Eastern science, being from Burma, and having practiced this and having had mentors his entire life. He's brought tremendous credibility to the idea that there are properties and healing values from plants and association with plants. The Persian Gardens, now these are near and dear to my heart. His Highness the Aga Khan has made a major donation of many, many millions of dollars to the Devonian Botanic Garden to build an Islamic garden. An Islamic garden is basically an offshoot from the very early Persian gardens. From the era of Muhammad is when they sort of took over the Islamic approach. But the Persian gardens were gardens that they came from the word paradisa. Now that sounds familiar to paradise. It is the etymology of paradise. They were areas of paradise on earth. They were respites from everyday life. They were places, some of them large enough to go hunting in, all of them large enough to go make love in. That was one of the earthly delights. There were drinking places. There were sitting places, reading places. A lot of poetry, a lot of sense in the Persian gardens. And that tradition continues. I don't know which of those activities we will allow in the Islamic garden. Some we might not be able to stop. Hippocrates, who is the father of modern medicine. You're going to hear several fathers here. You probably all know the Hippocratic Oath. The most popular part is first do no harm, but there are a lot of others. I mean, it was much more. Extremely well organized, early doctor. Used a lot of plants. There was pharmacopoeia. I didn't say that right. He used a lot of plants for medicines anyway. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, people know about this, but there's some question whether they ever even existed or whether they were just in Nebuchadnezzar's mind. He painted beautiful pictures with words. They were drawn much later, what they looked like. But whether they were ever invented, they've never been found anyway. And then I think things get really interesting. This trio I have here of Theophrastus, the Bible, and Pliny the Elder. If I were going to have another child, I would name him Theophrastus. As I've read about Theophrastus, I mean, what a great name. It's right up there with Erasmus, you know. Theophrastus was an incredibly, he's the father of botany. Here's another father for you. He wrote several books. I'll have to look at the names of them because I can't remember exactly. He wrote several books that had a shelf time, a useful shelf time of over 1,000 years, which is interesting in its own right. Okay. He wrote Inquiry into Plants and a second book on the cause of plants. These were hand transcribed for over 1,000 years and very useful throughout that period. He was from Lesbos in Greek, the town that made, what's that famous comedian's name? I can't remember her name. Anyway, it's what's put lesbians on the map, if you will. Sappho was a very erotic female writer, I think it was female, that sort of made this association between Lesbos and female love, and so hence the name persists. But Theophrastus was not a lesbian. Theophrastus was a guy. He was a very fat guy, apparently, from all things, really heavy guy. He wrote these great books. He dealt with plants. He organized plants. Then he went to save some buddies when Mount Vesuvius blew up, and he died of gas inhalation. So a fairly distinguished career. After that, I think it's pretty interesting that after that, the Pliny the Elder, in about 2,100 years before present, these guys sort of bracketed the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, I know the books of the Bible weren't written until somewhat later, apparently, but they were in that same era, distant removed. But in the Bible alone, there are 57 named plants that we can trace the taxonomy back to. There's wormwood and Artemis and all sorts of things. But Pliny the Elder clearly knew of Theophrastus' work, didn't cite it, but plagiarized it a little bit. But that's several hundred years, that's 400 years gap in there, I think. So they were communicating over time. Here in the era of RefWorks and ProSite and computer searches and Google Scholar, it's unthinkable to be accessing something 400 years ago at the most recent sources. But it's fascinating, the continuity of thought. And it's accumulative. Now, this is not science. This isn't hypothesis testing. This is purely inductive accumulation, snowball accumulation of knowledge over time. We'll get to the science part in a little bit. The Greek Dioscorides, he wrote a 5-volume set called Materia Medica, which was used in plants for medical purposes. This Materia Medica was translated into Greek, Latin, Yiddish, and interestingly, in 1934, it was translated for the first time into English. And people sat back and said, wow, the sophistication of what these guys were thinking back then. So we're still reinventing the wheel, These guys are just falling all over each other, learning some of the same things. It's in that never land between the oral tradition of maybe what we would see in Eastern medicine or First Nations medicine men, plant women, and what we might see in modern science. And so it didn't have the checks, the controls, quite the rigor you would expect. But it was classical, empirical, trial and error, and commentary on it. And it got better and better over time. Now we probably get a little more familiar, a little more comfortable when we get down here to Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Thomas Browne about 400 years ago. These guys were both botanical. They were learned men, Renaissance-type men. They could comment on many things. Francis Bacon had a quote that's always gotten under my skin, although there's a grain of truth to it. And I may misquote. It's something to the effect of, nature, in order to be commanded, must be understood. So I'm not keen about this commanded business, but I certainly am hot on the understood end of things. Again, still very utilitarian. There was a gap in here. Now, remember, we're on a different scale here, so it's only a couple hundred years. And now we come to some of the other fathers. Linnaeus, the father of systematics. Linnaeus, I always think of him as with trays of birds in front of him, but a lot of his early work was on plants. I mean, it's laid out. Plants don't kick, they don't bite, they don't run away. They're a lot easier to work with than animals, really. Linnaeus also contributed to the thought of Mendel, the father of genetics. And we all sort of know Gregor Mendel's plots out there where he's crossing sweet peas and understanding what F1 generations were, this basic biology stuff. Again, plants are the operative, pivotal component that allows these scientific insights that we've built this huge funnel onto. Now, a name that's less recognized, but one of my favorite characters is Justus Von Liebig. I ask this question on graduate committees quite often because he's a pet of mine. Liebig's law of the minimum. He was a chemist, I think Austrian, but he's best known for his idea of a barrel. And in this barrel, there's staves. And if one of these staves happens to be a little bit lower, that becomes your rate-limiting step for how much fluid you can put in that barrel. It's just a wonderful analogy. So this is Liebig's law of the minimum. And if this stave is fixed, another stave will be our lowest one somewhere. And so we're always working in chemical stoichiometry to find the rate-limiting step. This holds true. This is the precursor of carrying capacity, if you will. So this von Liebig, who greatly influenced Thomas Malthus, this same concept of limiting factors. And you'll all remember Malthus's population over time. We have a sigmoid growth. Malthus was a negative pessimist sort of guy. He said there will be these dramatic crashes. And here, it's vice and woe is what Malthus said was going to cause these declines. Vice and woe. That term apparently greatly influenced Darwin and Wallace. They said, vice and woe. Fine, we have vice and woe in this decline. What of these individuals that made it through there? Are they fundamentally different from those that died of vice and woe? That is the essence, the heart, the nugget of evolutionary theory. From that, Darwin expounded and carried forward the idea of not necessarily survival of the fittest, but demise of the unfit. So that was pivotal in Darwin's thinking, apparently. I'll mention it later, but Darwin will speak to my idea of advantages of enforcing nature. He did his best thinking while strolling along a beach-lined pathway near his house. That's where he went to contemplate and formulate these things. And I'm going to recommend that to all of us, to find a quiet place in nature to stroll. Things get a little confusing, and my modern history is not particularly good, but there was another cascade. Victor Shelford was here. At that point, the plants and the plant ecology and animal ecology separated. And things got a little simpler because we had just the plants, and then this cascade of the Clements and Gleason arguments we all know about, Tansley, Lindemann's work on trophic levels and energy, the Odoms with their modeling, Robert Whittaker, and on, the Jim Graces, the Martin Caldwells, the energetics crew. It gets really compressed in here. It gets really busy. And just as a sort of a joke, I went into Google Scholar and typed in garden, just to see how many hits I'd get. It took 0.04 seconds, whatever. 2,700,000 something hits. Bam. Gardens are woven throughout this plant world. They're a pretty big thing. So we have the father of taxonomy, the father of systematics, the father of evolution, we need a mother-in-law of plant ecology. Now, it's not just restricted to the sciences. Gardens and plants were pivotal to the fine arts. Think of Monet's water lilies. Think of John Keats, a medical doctor, by the way, better known as a poet. Let me read you a little bit of Keats' poetry, and I won't do this well. This comes from an ode to melancholy. Keats writes, No, go not to Lethe, neither twist wolfbane, tight-rooted for its poisonous wine, nor suffer thy pale forehead to be kissed by nightshade, ruby grape of Proserpine. Make not your rosary of yew-berries. In his one little gap of poetry, he's invoked medicinal plants. Bang, bang, bang. He was a doctor in the mid-1800s, and he was a poet, and he used that in his poetry. So plants are inspiring medicine, they're inspiring art, they're inspiring poetry. It's quite interesting that till 100 years ago, your chances of being improved by going to a doctor were 50-50. They're going to put leeches on you. They're going to let some blood out. They're going to make you drink tonics that they knew nothing about the constituents of. And they might kill you. But they were still learning. There was still this trial and error. Now, we've gotten better since then. But doctors have been I hope there are no doctors here, but they were on a pretty torturous path to success. Okay, so there endeth my backwards look. I'm not a very good history major. If somebody tells me, says, well, then he went and started talking about history. What's he going to do next? That's really not, that was for context. What I'd like to do here is propose 3 propositions. I call them hypotheses at first, but they're not falsifiable, and they're not really, I don't have alternates, so I'm going to call them propositions. The first I would call instinct. We are instinctively related to plants, and I'll try to build a small case for this, and I hope this is controversial enough to make you ask some killer questions, call BS on me, or add to it possibly. The second is that if one is true, then there must be advantages to embracing nature. And then finally, if these 2 are true, there's tremendous potential going forward that we've just barely tapped into. Everything that's old is new again. Everything. So let me begin. I'll begin with the arguments I used to have with my sociologist wife. A book called Sociobiology came out. It was written by Edmund Wilson, E.O. Wilson, about ant communities, social insects, and he made this huge jump to say that people share some of these attributes. Well, the sociologists went nuts. They were pulling their hair out. They were picketing, boycotting, writing screaming notes against Wilson. And my wife was amongst them. Me thinking there's an instinct here. There are some parallels. We can draw a line between animals to humans. We are animals. I was very much of the nature camp. She was of the nurture camp. And that standoff remained until we had children, until we went to daycare and saw little boys playing and little girls. Well, little boys weren't playing. They were at war. And little girls playing. And my wife said, by God, they're different species. They're not just different nature. They're different species. And she came around. Wilson has come up in the minds of sociologists and is somewhat credible now at last. Stephen Kellert and E.O. Wilson wrote a very provocative book entitled Biophilia a few years back, and I've used this in my wildlife class. Their contention is that we evolutionary are tightly linked to our environment, to animals, and to plants. That we carry with us this tremendous hindbrain and frontal lobe components for olfaction. And what the hell do we have to sniff, really? We all wear deodorant, we bathe regularly. And this is linked to the aromatherapy argument, that we're detecting things all the time, subliminally, consciously, that we don't make much sense of, but we could. That evolutionarily, it made tremendous sense to be walking down a path, smell rotten fruit, take a left, and walk to a tree and hit the jackpot of resources. So there seems to be the equipment there. Do we make use of it? They also make a lot of other interesting arguments that we're drawn to savannas with this 60-40 ratio of grass to trees. We love trees for escape cover to climb away from predators. They provide firewood. They provide nuts. They provide shelter. They provide shade. Provide materials for spears. The grasslands have a lot of small mammals and grazing animals. And everywhere except that central band of 2 and 3 canopy forest dwellers, people describe their ideal environment as being a savanna of some sort. It's what we appeal. It's what gardens do. It's what we have right outside our window here. It's what campuses do. It's what landscape architects do. They build savannas, this mixture of grassland. They build savannas where they shouldn't exist. They build savannas in the boreal forest. But we seem to be programmed for that to be a comforting, easing sort of environment. Kellert and then go further and say, well, you carry predispositions with you. And like what? Fear of snakes? We're not born afraid of snakes. But if we're given the slightest inclination to be afraid of snakes, spiders, or things that move mechanically, we pick it up just like that. Our parents might tell us time and time again, don't play with that electrical wire, stay away from cliffs, watch traffic, and we ignore it. But they say, watch out for snakes, and we internalize it. There's something different about snakes. That seems evolutionary. It seems like it fits. And I always poll my classes and say, how many of you have had fearful dreams about snakes? And there'll be about 25% of the hands go up. I won't embarrass you publicly here. About 25% of the hands go up. And I tell them, there are no dangerous snakes in Edmonton. There are no poisonous snakes here. There's no reason to have that dream. Unless a python falls out of the heating duct, or you're on an airplane and snakes come out of the vents, like we're all taught in these fear-mongering movies. So I would say that we're not only programmed to have certain instinctive linkages to nature, this instinct, we're also programmed to recognize windfall situations. I don't just say this. This is what they say. There is no more addictive activity than intermittent reward structures. People know this. They know this from gambling addiction, from sex addiction, from all sorts of compulsive behaviors. That we're programmed to look for the windfall. We want to scratch the lotto. We want to pull the one-armed bandit. We want to watch risk shows. We love that occasional winner thing, that winner take all. And I can speak from personal experience. Maybe you've had this experience as well. When you go out to pick berries and you find the perfect berry patch, there's a small endorphin rush. Why the hell have I planted corn every year for the last 5 years? And this year, I hit it out of the park. I had corn stalks coming out of my ears coming out of my ears. It would seem like an exercise of futility, but I so thoroughly enjoyed those corn stalks. And that's that intermittent thing. That's the time component. And I tell you, it's programmed in here. It's not just something that's cerebral. It's something that feels much deeper. We see this with fishing especially. People they'll cast all day. They call steelhead the fish of 1,000 casts. That anticipation with the occasional intermittent reward where you land a steelhead. So this obsessive thing, as I said, it can go to the stock market, to the internet, to watching American pickers on TV, looking for that windfall. There are gratifications in it, though. So I like the idea that gardens are a take-home message. There are intermittent rewards, that there's a time component. You plant with faith. You kneel to monitor and weed this thing. You hope, you nurture, and sometimes it pays off. And it's incredibly gratifying. That sequence of gardens is one of those things that brings us back and back and back. It's probably one of the reasons Bill likes to plant trees. I'll access another fairly popularized source. Richard Louv, the author of Last Child in the Woods, he did the popularized version. There is a body of scientific psychological literature that backs him up, though. His contention is that city kids that are disarticulated from nature have more behavioral problems, more health problems, more psychological problems. Kids that were given the chance to grow up climbing trees, playing in the slough, shooting their BB gun in the back 40, building forts, have exercised a mental ability to go into what's called flow experiences with nature. That's free association. There's an unlimited number of possibilities. Their instincts are activated if number one holds. Parts of the brain are stimulated, and this hurts a little bit to say this, but they have twice the brain activity of somebody sitting in a lecture, or watching TV. So it's multidimensional brain activity. This is something city kids miss out on. If your childhood had a woodlot or a back 40 or a slough in it, you know what I'm talking about. Now, another quick little advertisement for DBG. We put about 10,000 kids a year through our outdoor education program. They're swarming the place year-round. At plus 30, they're out there catching leeches and screaming and, ooh, I want to touch it. At minus 30, we're out there tracking moose and walking on the ice and drilling holes in the ice and building snow forts. And these kids are getting a sense for what outdoor means. A lot of ethnic kids, a lot of kids who have never laid down on the ground that wasn't at least mowed grass. They've never laid down in a forest. So there are 3 rules for our camps. First is, you have to get dirty. The parents go, what? The second rule is nothing is gross. It's only interesting. The third rule is there's no such thing as bad weather, just inappropriate clothing. And so once we give these kids permission to get dirty, to wear their bulky, crummy stuff, and they just embrace it. And we see in a 1-week period of these camps a transformation in these children. They go from, I will not lie down, there might be a spider there, to lying in the dust, flapping their arms, trying to make the biggest dust cloud they can. And the teachers are the ones that are most in awe. They say, these kids are exercising something that we've never been able to exercise before. These kids are behaviorally challenged, and yet they're listening to every word you're saying. They're behaving you. They're out of their element in a sense. And on the bus home, they're buzzing. They just love it. So The teachers are telling us this as well. This isn't restricted to children. I wish I could find this study. And this seems like a non sequitur, but it dealt with the shoe wear of Tokyo businessmen. They found lots of Tokyo businessmen will go 2 months at a stretch and never step off of a man-made surface. Carpet, asphalt, cement, tile, but no rocks, no grass, no soil. And their shoes wear differently from people in Alberta who shortcut across the lawn. So it makes you think of it. If a businessman is that ungrounded, literally, is not attached to nature, how can they make stewardship decisions at a national or international or even local level? That removal from nature, that lack of understanding, is one of those separations that gardens can bring back to us. Now, I suspect most of the people in this room are what my daughter would call earthers. Dad, you're just an earther. You dress in cotton clothes all the time. You got no style. You got no flash. You got no color. You want to go out in the woods. Come on, give me a break. Let's go to White Ave. My wife just finished reading a book, the title of which was, Mom, I hate you. You've ruined my life. Can you drive me and Brittany to the mall? One sentence. And that's what captures it, So I'm an earther. I have this connection. Most people in this room will have this connection to soil and earth and earthworms. But we're not normal. Most people are totally at odds with going out and walking in the bush, or going out and digging a hole, or paddling a canoe. This is the place that gardens become our surrogate wilderness, in a sense. This is one of the places people can honestly integrate and connect to nature. So they're not the real deal, maybe. They may be artificial as all get out, but they provide that linkage and that perception. They exercise those parts of the brain that don't get exercised enough. Okay. A second study. This one was published in Science in 1984 by R.S. Ulrich. You've probably heard this study. His control was people that were in a room in a hospital recovering from surgery that had a window, randomly assigned. The treatment was people in a room recovering from surgery that had a view of nature, of a park, of greenery. The people with the view of greenery healed significantly faster throughout the entire study, a very clear signal. And that started this whole realm of what's possible. What advantages are there to embracing nature? Ulrich is credited to that. More recently, Berman, in 2012, in the Journal of Affective Disorders, and I've just pulled a couple of examples. There are plenty of them in the literature. And you may have heard this on CBC News, found that a walk in nature, Darwin's path, if you will, significantly improved short-term memory. People could remember things better than they could if they were walking on a path rather than walking in a city environment. Well, then CBC again, and I didn't get the source, said that a walk down New York's Central Avenue provided more cognitive stimulation than did X number of years of life. I've forgotten the number. I think it was 4 in the early 1900s. So imagine you're a Google Cam that's sitting in rural Saskatchewan looking what's happening. Well, there's some corn growing over there. Wait a while. Now imagine that same Google Cam going down Central Avenue. We have honking taxis. We have sexualized models. We have this aroma of heroes. We have street meat being cooked. There's sexual predators. There's ladies with little dogs in their purses. There's the little droppings of the dogs on the sidewalk. You got panhandlers. You got musicians. It's such a stimulated environment that you don't have the RAM, if you will, up here to think creatively, to think originally, to think synthetically. So it doesn't surprise me at all when you're trying to cope in a city that you're not thinking like you might if you took a stroll in a garden or sat in Central Park. I think there are very clear advantages to embracing nature. And that's just one simple example. Now, I'm really glad John Gammon is sitting here. John came out to the garden recently. He and I took a walk, looking at some potential for some reflective research on conifer needles and such. And as we talked and walked through this garden, ideas started bubbling up. And I got real excited because he's talking reflectance, and as we're sitting there, I'm making the connection. There are 14 different species of conifers within sight in this common garden. They all look different to me, and they almost all will have different optical properties, and he knows how to measure that. I said, John, you got to look at this. So he said, it's a possibility. So we started the discussion. Those are the kind of connections that one wants in a natural environment. We weren't out in the woods. We were in a garden, for Christ's sake. So, I mean, I got to love that. I think we all need that little taste of paradisia when we walk through a garden. These gardens as creative places, just think about it. We have Einstein did some thinking in nature. Edward Abbey in Slick Rock Country, writing out in the desert. Thoreau on Walden Pond. Barack Obama at Camp David. I don't know where Stephen Harper goes to plug in or unplug. You know, I wish he did more outside time. I don't know how much he does, but I wish he did more. You know, I don't have the most remarkable publication record. I'm a B+ citizen of this faculty. I'm a good average 2.2 publications per year. That's me. You know, I'm racking them in there. But since I've gone to Devonian Botanic Garden, I've more than doubled that. So I'm thinking maybe there's something in the water. Maybe it's this olfactory stuff. Maybe it's the fact the place freezes up in November and I've got some time to write. But so there are some advantages, I think, to having this outside. There's a little table back in the pinetum that it's quiet. It still has 3G reception. Nobody bothers me. It smells great. There's squirrels and there's birds. And I can have 2 hours of uninterrupted time, no telephone, no bother, to think and write. Okay, the third book I'd like to talk about, let me check my time. Okay, the third book I'd like to mention in support of this is a book by Matthew B. Crawford. It's called Shop Class as Soulcraft. Matthew Crawford was a think tank analyst who had a PhD, had some high-powered job dealing with policy. After a year of that, he said, I can't really do this. I need some physical, tangible, to use the physical, tangible world as part of my brain. I think best when I'm doing and thinking. He makes a pretty compelling argument that if we live in a world of abstraction, of conceptual ideas, that we're not fully linking up our hands and our heads, and that we can spiral off into an unrealistic environment. He thinks that coping, moving, handling, tactile interaction with our environment is really important. Again, I bought his argument. I like the book, and I recommend it. Again, Shop Class as Soulcraft. He opened a little vintage motorcycle repair shop that he did really good work on. He's kind of famous now among the biker crowd. I think there are advantages to embracing nature here, and what's better than to grab a hoe or a shovel like Vic's carrying around? He's ready. He's ready to think creatively here. That fits your hand really well too, Jim. So I think that these sorts of physical expressions linked to mental thought have real advantage. There are lots more than just the sciences. Again, I'll use Devonian Botanic Garden, but most gardens have this. There's the art students that set up their easels that gain inspiration from the colorful foliage. There's outdoor performance art. We have opera in the garden. We have sculpture classes in the garden. These could be done in a gymnasium in town, but no, they seem to work better in the garden. Why might that be? I don't know, but they're all oversubscribed. Cultural and religious studies. You know, we have a Japanese garden. We have a Native Peoples garden. We're going to have an Islamic garden. I hope someday we'll have a Chinese garden. These are places where peace stupas, these are convening places. These are places where you go there, you stand there, and you think about things that you might not have thought about otherwise. This is ambiance, smells, sights, and an expectation that you will think about something other than just the candy bar or the drive home, where you get out of your normal sphere. Gardens are really, really good for that. It's not a surprise that we're booked on weddings all the way through 2014, and we have a backlog waiting for people to get in. These gardens carry rich cultural messages. They carry messages about history. They carry messages about aesthetics. They let us see the world through other people's eyes. They let us see why a Japanese artist will have no signs in their garden, rocks placed in a certain way, the sound of running water, the sense of things, of certain trees on the upwind side, trees pruned to mimic a different era, a garden built in a bowl so you're obscured from sound. They create a universe. These places can foster not only creative thought within science, but creative inspiration for arts, poetry, song, dance. 2 weeks ago, we had the arts department out for the Islamic Holy Music outdoor concert. And to hear the tablas and the instruments coming through the garden was just spectacular. It was really moving. Okay, my final hypothesis. There's tremendous potential going forward. Let's fast forward. There's a new tribe of socially aware folks. Now, most of us, not all of you, but most of us are dinosaurs in this regard. You might not have heard of Fluxus, the coordination of large groups to be part of a project. The Public Works Group in London, Sarah Cize's installation on New York's High Line, the International Garden Festival at Jardins des Métis, Marichka Portrick's many agricultural infrastructure projects in Europe, U.S., South America. But more humbly, think about corn mazes and rooftop gardens and green roofs, communities in bloom, front yards. These are things that are just popping up like crazy. How many community gardens do you think we have in Edmonton? Community gardens. 80. We have 80 community gardens. And that's up from probably less than a dozen 10 years ago. So this is a movement. If you think gardening is not political, think again. Gardening is incredibly political. If you watched the Northeast Corridor, where they're trying to put in Upgrader Alley on some of the prime microclimate growing soils, great example. If you've been following the South Campus wars about what one group wants to do versus another group, do we have big shiny steel buildings, or do we have green space, places to walk your dogs, do crops research, and have community gardens? There's a bit of a difference there. Apparently the most valuable real estate in all of New York City is Central Park. And it's not developed with high-rise. It's something that can't be replicated. If we can just hang on to these jewels long enough, their value will skyrocket. So there might be a few. Jan, you might be old enough to remember Victory Gardens, or at least your parents would have. Gardens have been political for a long time. There's a lot of potential there. Guerrilla gardening. I've seen it on White Avenue. Folks planting stuff here and there. The entire underground economy of British Columbia on marijuana. You know, there are subtexts here that are plant and gardening related that defy simple explanation. I love the fact we have a bunch of illegal guerrilla chicken coopers in town too. You know, I want to raise chickens in my backyard as well. So I'm going to end up here, and I just want to leave you with a call to arms, or rather a call to hose, with this simple statement. Gardens have been guiding humanity through science for a long, long time. They're now reinserting themselves into our lifestyles, our cultures, our societies. And I think it's in a very good way. So if they're a crucible for understanding our world, for reconnecting with our world, they deserve the support and investment of the public. So I would say if you want to improve your health, your children's behavior, your scientific contribution, your concentration, grab a hoe or a shovel. Thank you very much. Okay.